5:31 in the morning. It's Radio Free 102.3 KJLH. We're talking with renowned scholar, Dr. Gerald Horne. He's an historian and an author. He is the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Find his books everywhere books are sold, but especially at SO1. Talk to me, Dr. Gerald Horne, about the census. We heard that the power in this nation is shifting to the South. It is shifting away from the Rust Belt. California lost a seat. These are based on counts, census counts, which show that the population's moving. That California, even though our population continues to grow, not fast enough to keep up with other states. Your state of Texas gains, I think, 1 seat, or is it 2? In any case, what does this mean? I mean, is this going to be a shift of power towards the Republicans who traditionally run these states, or does it all even out through redistricting?
It's not good news, particularly the fact that Texas is gaining more seats and Florida is gaining more seats. In Texas, as we speak, there is a bill in the state legislature that makes the bill in Georgia that attracted so much attention seem tame and mild by comparison. In Florida, there's a bill that's in the process of being ratified that would seek to curb Black Lives Matter type protests, including giving immunity to drivers who drive into protesters and injure and maim them. So the census results are not good news. The population of the United States generally is leveling off, which is a big change in general over the decades, since the 1930s perhaps. And in any case, since we know that with this strange electoral college that you have to elect the president, when Texas and Florida gains more seats, that makes it easier to elect a Republican president in November 2024.
Yeah, so that's not offset in any way by the fact that these greater populations in some of these regions are getting browner and blacker and possibly turning some of these traditionally red states purple or blue?
Well, that's possible in North Carolina, for example,
right,
where the Latino population is growing by leaps and bounds. But I'm afraid to say there's some disparaging news from Texas, where Donald J. Trump in November 2020 did much better than expected amongst the Mexican-American population. And thirdly, he did quite well amongst the Cuban-American and Venezuelan-American community in South Florida, for example. Then another trend we need to pay attention to is, the fact that this work from home phenomenon. As a matter of fact, as far as I know, you're doing this broadcast from your apartment.
That's correct.
Exactly, as opposed to the KJLH studio. And that's a long-term phenomenon. And that's going to have impact on the economy as well, because people are not going to necessarily be spending money in downtown cafes or mass transit, for example. And then you have to think about the political consequences of that. And then the other factor is the growth of the tech sector, which is expanding tremendously. For example, in Austin, Texas, bringing in new jobs and employment. Speaking of Tesla, for example, or Apple just announced a new complex in North Carolina. So the country is changing before our very eyes.
Yeah, I was worried you were going to say that. We'll see. I do think that it doesn't look good because as you mentioned, as those states get more representatives, they also get more electoral college votes. And Florida has always been a problem. And when you talk about Latinx people, I was surprised because I know that there are many different kinds of Latinos. There are a lot of different nations that go under that one label. So I initially assumed that those Trump voters were Cubans and Venezuelans, which makes sense. They're going to be conservative. The reason they come here is they're leaving socialist countries. But when it turns out that a lot of those folks are Mexican, what? Wait, what? That is problematic. That is very worrisome, actually.
Well, even within the Mexican and Mexican-American community, you have to make distinctions because in Arizona and Colorado, they did not necessarily vote the way they did in South Texas. And I think part of the problem with Texas is that the state is so conservative that it affects us all. It forces everybody to the right. And we really need to do something about Texas. We need to make it a national priority because Texas was not only a slave state, it was not only in the vanguard of fighting the U.S. Civil War to keep slavery in the 1860s, but then Texas also was the state that probably had the most vicious wars against Native Americans, speaking of the people we call the Comanches in particular. So that conservatism in Texas is so deeply ingrained and deeply inured that it affects the politics of the whole country. It's like having a sore on your leg that then leaches into the bloodstream of the body.
Okay, that's really pleasant. A morning image. Thank you, Dr. Gerald Horne. You've said, speaking of Biden's first 100 days, that you think domestically much better than internationally. Talk to me about Afghanistan. How do you view the president's decision to try to get troops out of there by 9/11, why there's so much pushback from that?
Well, I think it was inevitable that the United States would have to pull out of Afghanistan. The war has been going on, actually, not only for more than 20 years, but you could say more than 40 years, because within the late 1970s, that Jimmy Carter and his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, began to intervene in Afghanistan in order to draw the then Soviet Union into a quagmire, which succeeded. But it involved this alliance with these religious zealots, symbolized by Osama bin Laden, who then wreaked revenge on the United States, we are told, on September 11, 2001. And since that time, the Taliban, in some ways, is not really the most malign force in Afghanistan, because Islamic State is in Afghanistan as well, and they make the Taliban look like choir boys. So when the United States pulls out by September 11th, I don't think your listeners should be expecting good news to come from that Central Asian country.
There's so many things like this in the news. It sounds good on paper, but then when you dig a little deeper, there's so many unintended consequences, or maybe they are intended consequences. What should we be tracking as conscious people that maybe we're not tracking on the world stage? You pointed out the attempted coup in France. That's a good one. What else are we losing in our day-to-day focus on mass shootings and pandemic?
Well, I think many of us have at least one eye on this spectacular rise in violence against the Asian American community. But in my opinion, I cannot separate that from these growing tensions with China. In fact, there's a novel climbing the bestseller charts. It's called 2034. It's co-written by a former NATO commander. That's the U.S. military alliance with the Western European nations. That the whole premise of the novel is a war with China. And so people in Southern California should be very concerned about that, because if, heaven forbid, there is a war with China, Southern California will be smacked right in the jaw.
Why do you say that? I mean, aside from the fact that we have a large Chinese population here and more hate crimes than any single state against Asian Americans in California, not a thing I'm proud of, but certainly something to look at. Why do you say that?
Well, it'll be a Pacific war. And there's nothing but ocean separating Los Angeles from China. And inevitably, it'll be a naval war. And I don't even really want to talk about it that deeply, because it's just so chilling to contemplate
Yeah.
the fact that the two most powerful nations on planet Earth, that there is discussion, serious discussion in high-level circles about a military conflict. It's too gruesome to contemplate.
Why such a big deal that President Biden called the Armenian the Turkish campaign against Armenians genocide? I know, Armenian activists and historians have been trying to get a U.S. president to do this for quite some time, and he recently did so. Why is this a big deal?
Well, certainly in Southern California, once again, there should be concern. California has the largest population of our people of Armenian extraction outside of Armenia itself. I have to confess that maybe I'm a cynic, but I was looking for the underlying reason why Mr. Biden decided to make this move. Obviously, it's going to inflame tensions with Turkey, which is now being accused of genocide. And I had thought the United States and Turkey were getting closer together, particularly with regard to their mutual support of Ukraine against Russia. But this undermines that particular initiative. And so I'm really, other than the humanitarian reason, I'm not really sure why Mr. Biden chose this moment to charge the Turks with genocide. But certainly it's going to be good news for Glendale, California, and good news for the Armenian American community in the Valley as well.
5:43 in the morning. We're talking with Dr. Gerald Horne. I know you've been tracking the story of Bruce's Beach. I know you've been tracking what appears to be some momentum for the concept, at least, of reparations. In the middle of a lot of bad news, I like to focus on good news. What are your thoughts on those?
Well, I have to say, once again, I was taken aback by this serious conversation about compensating the Bruce family, I believe that's their name, who about 100 years ago controlled this very valuable piece of real estate, Manhattan Beach, up to and including returning their property to them. I have to say, that's taken me by surprise. Likewise, I have to say I've been taken by surprise by this deepening conversation about reparations, the fact that H.R. 40, the reparations bill, passed the Judiciary Committee of the House.
At long last.
Right. It's going to the floor. Will probably pass the House. I'm not sure if it'll pass the Senate. But in any case, that's good news. And the fact that you have these local initiatives, which actually communities in Southern California need to study. I'm speaking of Evanston, Illinois, where there have been housing discrimination for decades against black residents, and now they're going to be compensated. I think that Compton and Inglewood and Hawthorne and the city of Los Angeles, activists in those communities should study Evanston, because there's been rampant discrimination historically against black communities there. And they need to replicate what Evanston, Illinois has sought to do. It could mean money in your pocket, quite frankly.
I love that idea. Continuing our conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne. We're going to get to Chauvin. I promise you that's next. Radio Free 102.3 KJLH. Dr. Gerald Horne is with us. He is an historian and an author. Dr. Horne, it is always enlightening to talk with you. And of course, you can't leave the virtual building without giving us your take on the Derek Chauvin verdict.
Well, certainly it was a victory, but I don't think we should make too much of it, not least because of that headline you just read about the spate of killings and the immediate aftermath of the conviction of Derek Chauvin for murdering George Floyd on tape. Number one, it led to protests in the United States, and then that led to global protests. And that's quite unusual in terms of these police killings that take place so regularly in the United States. And then the third, perhaps the most significant factor, is that the prosecution was spearheaded by Keith Ellison, the Minnesota Attorney General, a former leader of the Congressional Black Caucus. He was able to marshal the resources of the state of Minnesota, bringing in expert witnesses from all over the country, including Los Angeles, who provided a very compelling case. He had about a dozen lawyers on his side. Mr. Chauvin had one lawyer on his side. And I think that the weight of the state of Minnesota outweighed the case that Derek Chauvin presented for himself. But as I said, I'm sure you're following that case in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, where Anthony Brown apparently was shot in the back of the head by the authorities, not to mention the case in Columbus, Ohio, where a 16-year-old black teenager was killed. So the beat goes on.
Yeah, the beat does go on. Black Lives Matter is now calling for the abolishing of police unions. I don't know quite how that would work, but it certainly seems that they have to be dealt with in some manner. You talk about Chauvin's defense. That was paid for by the police unions. And in many of these cases, like the case of Andrew Brown, they are the ones that are pushing to suppress that tape. The Brown case to me is outrageous because they refused to let the family see the police body cams, or at least 7 cops on the scene. And then what they did show them was 20 seconds long from one camera with all the faces and weapons blurred out. What is that realistic? How could these, I call them cartels, how could their influence be limited, at least in politics?
Well, in San Antonio, Texas, there's a measure on the ballot for an upcoming election to strip the police of collective bargaining rights. And I must confess, people I respect are opposed to stripping the police of collective bargaining rights, although I have to confess I'm in favor of it, because when Derek Chauvin has a bail hearing, if he gets bail, the money will be put up by the police union. And that would be outrageous because even though he might have to turn over his passport, you cannot rule out the possibility that he might try to skip the country. For example, I know if I were in his shoes, I'd be trying to skip the country. So
where would he go, though?
Well, you go to a country where there's no extradition treaty with the United States of America.
Right.
Remember, all the Nazis wound up going to Paraguay and Argentina, for example.
Good point. So that is a slippery slope because as progressives, people have to have, union. They have to have the right to unionize. I mean, police are workers, but at the same time, why are they able to be co-conspirators in crimes? Why are they able to go above and beyond what a union would do? Why are they endorsing candidates? To me, even though other unions do that, public safety unions should not be endorsing candidates because they're supposed to protect everybody.
Well, it's even worse. I'm sure you saw that 60 Minutes piece about how the 18,000 plus police units and departments in the United States of America are infiltrated from top to bottom by Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Boogaloo Boys, and all these other insurrectionist-type groups that showed their teeth on January 6, 2021. But in terms of good news, there was a press conference yesterday led by black lawyers in the United States, but it was an international panel investigating police crimes in the United States. And it got a lot of attention overseas. They're talking about trying to bring a case before the International Criminal Court in The Hague, the Netherlands, against these police units. And I'm not sure if that'll work, but certainly got a lot of publicity overseas. And once again, one of the reasons why the Chauvin case was so important was precisely because of the traction it obtained overseas.
Yeah, I think that's important in terms of, exposing the role that's really being played here. Dr. Gerald Horne, we just got a couple minutes left, actually about a minute. What would you leave us with this morning? You've always got so much information.
Well, what I would leave you with is to pay careful attention to Mr. Biden's speech. And this could be a significant turning point if we play our cards right. It's a typical Robin Hood type maneuver, taking money from the wealthy and redistributing it to the poor and to the working class. And we need to make that a general movement, to take money from the 1% and redistribute it to the 99%.
Well said, Dr. Gerald Horne. It's great to talk with you. Look forward to talking with you, hopefully not too far after this address, because I'd love to hear your thoughts in unpacking what the president has to say today.
Right on.
We got to go. Passing the mic to Steve Harvey, Ade Lamar, and the crew. As you go on your way about your day, let's take a moment to affirm ourselves. Let's take that deep breath in and let us release. Today, let me remember, in the words of Coretta Scott King, who celebrated her birthday, her angelversary, as I say, on yesterday. Struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. Until next time, Radio Free Family, one love.